Okay, so welcome back in the afternoon session. Now we have a keynote on biosimilars optimizing market access. I think one of the most relevant and current topic. So I have a great pleasure in introducing the speaker, Clement Ishpaninger, who is Senior Director and Head of Project Management Office, Global Program Lead. I'm so sorry, I'm reading Clemens. I'm absolutely sorry who couldn't join. So the pleasure is mine to introduce Edric Engert, who is Managing Director, Abraxeolus Consulting. And he is located in US. So Edric, first of all, thank you so much for joining so early in the morning. And Edric runs this boutique consultancy company, Abraxeolus Consulting, with expertise in healthcare in areas such as strategy, its operationalization, business development, in-licensing, portfolio strategy, selection and management, operational involvement programs, turnarounds, corporate development, and M&A. Previously, Edric worked as the head of biosimilars unit for Teva, so no better speaker for this topic than Edric. So over to you, Edric.
Thank you so much, Samir. I appreciate it. And thank you for all of you for joining. I'm going to jump right into the task at hand here, meaning the our agenda for the day. And I've laid it out here before you in 5 points. We're going to talk about launch plans in general for biosimilars. We'll also walk through an overview of a comparison of risks versus returns in the biosimilar space, but in some ways also how it compares to other sub-industries within pharmaceuticals. I'm going to try to show to all of you at sort of a high level a potential framework or means by which you can manage risks and optimize your market access. And then the real crux of the matter is the deep dive into the commercial considerations in the US. So I have served many clients globally, and I had global responsibility for biosimilars while at Teva, but I can tell you all that one, US is where the money is, US is also where the risk is, and US is also, frankly, where my deepest areas of expertise are. Finally, in the end, we'll do a brief overview of less regulated markets. The first reaction that many of you may have is that we have 30 minutes. And even if I were not to allow any questions and answers, that would only give us 6 minutes for each of these bullet points. That's clearly impossible. So please view this as a discussion starter. I'm not pretending to be able to show all of you comprehensive and detailed answers to all of these agenda points. But I would like to highlight, in my opinion, what some of the key messages are, and frankly, just start the discussions. And I'll be very open.
Edric, sorry for the interruption. Are you on your second slide or some further slide? Because we only see your first title sheet right now.
So I'm on a page called Our Agenda.
Yeah, so unfortunately, something is wrong. So I suggest that you stop your screen sharing. And yeah, and now, and then start it again, perhaps it will work.
Okay.
And while you are doing that, I must say that this topic actually needs 2 full days, most probably. So yeah, now we see our agenda. Okay.
Okay, wonderful. So these are the 5 agenda points that I just walked you through. And as I said, I'm going to jump into them. But again, consider this sort of an appetizer. So let's begin with a launch plan in biosimilars. I'll start by pointing out that, when it comes to launch planning, the initial reaction may be for some, it's all about the brand. And hence, it's all about the field forces. And when I say field force, I mean things like pharma sales representatives. And pharma sales representatives certainly do play a critical role in biosimilars, especially in some markets. But we really need to view biosimilars as this space between branded pharmaceutical products and generic pharmaceutical products. They actually have some commonality with both. So you can't think, wow, we've got this great product, let's have the right field force, and yes, we'll get the uptake that we need. That's wrong, frankly, but it's also wrong to think, well, it's just like generics. It's a biogeneric, basically, even though we're forced to call it a biosimilar. And, because we don't have substitution, that's not really going to be the way this plays out either. In fact, if we go to the next page, this is a US illustration of all the different types of stakeholders that exist between the product that you see on the left side of the page and the patient that you see on the right side of the page. And again, this is just a US illustration, but you can see that their health plans, in other words, the insurance companies, they're the pharmacy benefit managers, they're large self-funded employers that only use third-party administrators. If I even just focus on those three buckets, it's just a wealth of work that needs to be done. It's not driven by substitution, and it's not driven by just detailing physicians. And it starts to, I think, show just how complex a problem this is, and hence how comprehensive an approach is required to get this done correctly. On the next page, what I show, you might be confused at first as to what these two images even mean and what their relevance is. The photo that you see with the X through it is actually a 100-meter dash. The other photo that you see is the World Championship Kona Ironman. And my point here is that preparing properly for a biosimilar launch, you have to view it as an Ironman. It takes an enormous amount of preparation, and it's going to be a long race. I'll tell you that in my personal opinion, each subcomponent of commercialization can vary, but there's some parts that frankly should start 2 years before you launch the product. So don't think of this as a sprint and you open the floodgates and all the products just are immediately being driven by uptake of the market. It's a much longer, grueling battle than a 100-meter dash. Again, that's just some key messages only that I wanted to highlight as far as the launch plans for biosimilars are concerned. What I'd like to do now is start to highlight for you some of the risks and returns as I see them, and some of the different viewpoints and vantage points we can use to try to assess where do biosimilars really stand and how do they even compare to other product modalities. In this very next chart that you see here, slide 8, I refer to POS, which is probability of success. And this is based on some data that I gleaned several years ago. So this is a little bit dated, but I have every reason to believe that it still is a true representation of the type of POS that we see in different types of product modalities. On the left side of the vertical bar graph, we talk about novel small cells. We're talking about organic chemistry driven products, not biologically driven products. And here, believe it or not, you actually have the lowest probability of success. Everyone thinks biotech is such an incredibly complex thing. And yes, it's been on the market now for a while, but it's still a newer technology compared to how pharmaceuticals have been delivered to the markets for decades and decades and decades. And that's true. But in fact, novel biologics have a much higher probability of success, basically double the POS that novel small cell products have when they first enter the fray of a company's pipeline. Very interestingly, biosimilars, although again, it's complex, it's not easy, we're easily between 45 and 50% probability of success for any product that is initiated, which is a much, much higher probability of success than novel biologics. And interestingly, you can leverage very similar skills and infrastructure when it comes to research and development, when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to supply chain management, and even when it comes to commercialization. Generics is perhaps the only modality that represents such a higher POS. Frankly, the generics vertical bar, I just made this up. I called it 90%. It depends on if you look at the really easy products or if you include complex generics or some of the much more difficult modalities in injectable space. But I think 90% is an accurate portrayal, at least from a relativistic perspective compared to the other modalities. And yet, in spite of the fact that we have this high POS for biosimilars, many still view biosimilars as an incredibly risky business. I'm not going to read through every single point of this chart, but there are lots of different components that drive risk in biosimilars. And the question is, how can we grab that reward? And to sort of put some people's minds at ease, I'll show you an example of what can even happen in hyper competition. In other words, don't worry, if you do it right, there is a reward. And I just pulled together here a very conceptual and hypothetical example for illustration only here on slide 10. And here what I've done is I've rounded the numbers significantly for adalimumab. And I'm also not showing numbers that are using numbers that I'm forecasting as to what I think is going to happen in year of launch or 5 years after launch. These are just numbers that I think are in the realm of reason to show how the numbers can play out. So let us jump to adalimumab. and let us think about just how many companies were actually approved and actually reached settlements already for launches in 2023 with AbbVie. And if I round the numbers a bit and I talk about the brand sales being $30 billion, and if I assume that biosimilars are able to penetrate 60%, as you can see in the next bucket below, that means there's $18 billion worth of value that the biosimilar players can sort of fight over as far as value acquisition is concerned. And if, again, we had just assumed, to keep the numbers easy, that there are 10 players and each one gets exactly the same portion of market share, we skinny this down by 10%. We're then down to $1.8 billion. And then if you assume that there's price compression of 30% relative to the branded price, that actually brings us down to net revenue per player of $1.26 billion per player for a product that is deemed to be hyper-competitive. Again, this is not a forecast of mine. I'm just trying to use this as an illustrative example of how the revenues, in spite of the risk, even in hyper-competition, can sometimes blow away the types of investments that were needed. Now keep in mind, in biosimilars, the investments in R&D are considerably higher than in something like generics. But if we had time, I'd love to spend some time also talking about how you can actually lower your investment by the strength of your analytics, because you start wiping out clinical development costs. Be that as it may, again, we're already 14 minutes into the presentation. So this is, again, just a whetting of the appetite. Let me start to address the next agenda point, which is this very high-level framework. How can we make sense of all these different risks that I showed you before, with those different balls of risks and the reward they're cut in the middle? How can these things actually be addressed? And in short, it's really all about being incredibly proactive and having some key ingredients in your arsenal. The first is have the right industry knowledge and expertise. And this also comes down to doing a very clear internal assessment as to where you're strong and where you're not strong. Where you're not strong, you got to be honest about it, and you got to pull in the right partner. It could be a commercialization partner, it could be an IP partner, it could be a CSO, it could be contractors that you're using in consulting firms. You just need to be very honest about your competencies and your capacities and what can be done. And as I mentioned before, then, in my opinion, one of the key points is that you need incredibly detailed and rigorous processes that are triggered at an incredibly early phase. Anybody that's thinking about launching adalimumab in 2023, they should not be having discussions about how they're going to be doing it in October of 2022. That would be an enormous mistake. Another tip that I would give anyone addressing these types of risks is to really take an integrated approach across all affected downstream areas. What I mean by that is, if you think there's a commercial risk, don't just necessarily engage your sales and marketing infrastructure. There are sometimes many other components of your company that come together in an integrated approach to address the risks at hand. Finally, the last 2 points, realize it's not exactly a brand and it's not exactly a generic. You're going to have to pick parts of both to do it properly and most effectively. So, what are the types of steps that one can go through to bring discipline and rigor to the risk mitigation that needs to occur? I'm just going to touch upon specific examples of each of these steps at a high level so you can see exactly what I mean. It's all about prioritization. Yeah, it's important to think about downstream as you think of these scenarios unfolding in the market. What are all the ways that these things could play out? Think about which specific parts of your organization could be affected by this. In other words, operational specificity. This comes back to this integrated approach method that I mentioned on the earlier slide. Then we come back to step 4, that it's time to blow out the detailed plan. And throughout all of this, step 5 is that constant need for internal assessment. What are we doing? How can we do it better? What are our strengths? What are our development areas? Where do we need help, etc.? So to use one example, we could be looking at commercialization tactics, one of the priorities that we're going to view as to risks in launching successfully a biosimilar. And here I'm talking about things like the contracts that some of the branded pharmaceutical firms could be engaging in with health plans or with integrated delivery networks, and how those potentially create roadblocks to biosimilars. It could be about the horrific rebate trap, which is something we could spend an entire session on just at one point. And hence this, and finally, this other photo that might seem a little confusing with the logging that's occurring somewhere there. That actually is just a visual, poetic reference to product bundling, what some companies may be doing and have been accused of, for example, in the cases like infliximab, of branded pharmaceutical firms at times using bundled strategies to actually influence even more strongly, excuse me, their power in the rebate game. So to pick up the pace just a little bit, I won't spend a lot of time here. The point is, again, understand the downstream implications. Think about policy and government affairs. Think about alliance building with other companies and even completely other entities so that you have greater success and greater weight in everything that you're doing. Think about how you can work together with the FDA, if we're talking about the US now, and the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, to help you combat such commercialization tactics by the branded pharmaceutical firms. Thankfully, the FDA, for example, under the leadership of Scott Gottlieb and others, were able to create the Biosimilars Action Plan, which was a great first step at really hitting an inflection point for the US in the direction that it should be going in. And finally, think of all of this, not just in the systemic way, but also the complexity and choices that need to be made and the individual product bases and then your portfolio as a whole. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this chart either. I think it's already pretty clear. You got to think about all the different parts of the organization when you're addressing these risks. Here's an example. You don't just think about launch. That's the space shuttle you see there. Okay, what do we do immediately at pre-launch, and how does our commercialization infrastructure optimize all this to the best extent possible? It could go back even earlier to things like how you select products. It certainly should go to the point from selection and onwards, excuse me, as you enter development, clinical development, how you even manage the product and your approach on an ongoing basis. You would also need to include an enormous amount of market intelligence to make sure that you are making as informed decisions as possible and that you're managing and understanding how the market may be changing over time, over the lifetime of this product, even during development. And then finally, how that can affect the forecasts. The other part that I always like to include here is the Capitol building. In Washington, policy and GA, which stands for government affairs. Oftentimes, government affairs and policy making is done by sort of a think tank in Washington that is much too separate from the commercial operations and the leaders of a pharmaceutical organization. I would highly, highly suggest that it becomes very integrated into the way how we even do business together. Because sometimes it's not just important to know what's happening, it's equally important to understand how you can influence what's actually happening. I'm going to skip this. We know that we have to build detailed action plans. Perhaps you get copies of the slides later. I mentioned this before too. This is sort of the picture of the confessional, because to me, this is the thing that most companies have the most difficult time doing, is really doing honest and credible internal assessments as to how things are going, what can be done, what can't be done alone, and how things can be turned around and optimized even further. This allows us to now go into what we're calling a deep dive. It's not really going to be a deep dive, as Samir alluded to in the beginning. You know, we could spend days on this, and probably days just on this one bullet point right here. But let me give you a little bit of a smattering of a taste, again, with a focus on the United States. I can begin with just showing this photo, and I've shown some people this photo before, and I always ask the question, you know, do you know even what it is? What is this photo actually representing? It's actually an oncology clinic. This is where oncology patients go to get their therapies administered and to get consultations in the offices next door. And the question is, what is the next question, I should say, is where does the majority of their income actually originate? Does it come actually infusing and delivering the IV-related products or others? Does it come from the consultations from the oncologists themselves? Is it even split between the two? Is it something else? Shockingly, perhaps for some of you, the answer is that 60% of it, on average, comes from buy and bill. And for those of you that have never heard this expression before, let me briefly explain what I mean by that. The oncology clinics actually acquire the products from distributors or from GPOs or directly from the pharmaceutical firms. They buy these products, and that's of course at a certain price. And then after these products are delivered and then administered to the patient, they bill the relevant payer. It could be a commercial insured population, and very often it's also Medicare, the body that governs the sort of national payer system, so to speak, for the elderly in the United States. That spread, the delta between buy and bill, is actually what makes up 60% of their income. I'm going to pause here for a moment because if whether you knew this already or not, it's incredibly important to go back in our minds that page where I showed all the different stakeholders between the product and the patient, because this starts to illustrate in perfect terms how we really need to know what really drives, motivates, and incentivizes each of those stakeholders, because these are the very things that we will have to take into account when we launch a product, when we create our channel strategy, when we create our payer strategy, when we decide where to set WAC and what discounts to offer to whom and for how much. Of course, it becomes all even more complicated if we realize there's no such thing as just price, right? There's wholesaler acquisition cost, there's average selling price, there's rebate, there's the reimbursed price, but then there's also the net price. And we have to have absolute clarity and transparency into what these words even mean as we go through the data and go through our market intel to answer those fundamental questions. What's our channel strategy? What's our payer strategy? What are our pricing tactics actually going to be? On this page here, I actually start to show exactly how the pricing dynamic works between buy and bill. I'm going to go through this now very quickly because I'm looking at the clock. We only have 5 minutes left. You're hopefully going to get copies of the presentation and you continue with your questions later. Let me just say that there's a huge spread between what the net price, the small blue things that they pay, versus the average selling price and the markup. That's what shows you that huge margin that's really driving 60% of the income of the oncologists. But of course, we need to know to what extent every time we look at an oncology product, how much of it is even going through the oncology clinics. And it's this type of work that's required, and it begs all these critical pre-launch questions for any product, which is, what is the universe of settings we should even be considering for the product at hand? Is it oncology clinics? Are they pharmacies? Are there hospitals? Is it a combination of the above? And if so, to what extent? What are all the other stakeholders that are involved? And we talked about what incentivizes them. And then, as I mentioned before, how do I decide channels and pricing and payer strategies? And then finally, how could the market actually evolve differently over time? What are all the various scenarios that could unfold? And how can I build contingency plans and strategies for each so that as things develop, I can just trigger my strategy and refine my strategy immediately without hesitation? There are lots of components, therefore, that need to be addressed in commercialization. There's the marketing puzzle piece. There's the market access puzzle piece, some of which we started to address here today. There's the sales piece. There's the medical piece there. I'm referring to medical science liaison and the like. There's the operational piece. And there's, of course, the distribution of the product, the wholesalers. In the interest of time, because I know we're almost out now, I'm going to skip over all the less regulated markets. I'll show you, just clicking through these pages, that I created a little bit of a map as to which countries I focused on and why. And for each of these countries, I tried to lay out for you one of the key takeaways as to what the benefits are in each of these countries and what some of the challenges are. I told you it was impossible to do this in 30 minutes. I hope you can see that the takeaway is there's a lot of work to be done if you're going to do this right. But the risks will be incredibly outweighed by the returns. Here is my contact information for anyone that wants to dive deeper and deeper and deeper into this and continue the discussion. Thank you so much.
Wow, Edric, amazing. The bang on 30 minutes. So one of the questions actually which came in the chat box was from John Robert, who was asking, or who is asking, is there a projection that the emerging markets also would gain more traction when it comes to biosimilars in the near future? So those were the last 5 slides, or 5-6 slides you were mentioning. So since we have just about 2 minutes, so maybe we can take these couple of questions. So maybe elaborate a little bit in general about emerging markets, please.
Okay, sure, absolutely. It's interesting because in the emerging markets, there's some uptake that's already occurring in some markets more than others, and each of them can behave in an incredibly different way. Some markets mimic much more what you see in Europe or what you see in the United States, and you can even leverage your applications in those countries in those other emerging markets. Other markets are much more focused on not just biosimilars, but bio-betters and bio-anything that meets the unmet medical needs of patients. So it's much less strict than what we see, for example, in the United States, where it's novel biologics, biosimilars, and hardly anything else. And then, in fact, there are other markets that add yet another twist to the question, where they realize not just the value to the patients, but the value to potential industries, domestic industries, where they try to force the development and manufacturing of such products within their boundaries for the sale of such products to even be distributed within their countries. Brazil, I think, is the perfect example of that, where you have these development partnerships that must be created, where you're handing over tech ops to other entities within Brazil to even have the right to sell your product within Brazil. So that's just a smattering, but I hope the audience finds that useful.
Yeah, no, I think very, very useful. So what we will do, Edric, is that because the next session is a panel discussion where you are also there, and we will take up some of these and similar questions together. So let's stand by to go offline for a second before all the other panel members for the next panel also join. So I request Y Summit team to now make us to bring in the others as well from the panel.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Edric, for a lovely presentation.
Thank you.